Of all the brilliant and ambitious warriors who drew their swords to cut the American Republic free from the British Empire, few possessed the dazzling tactical genius and the Cavalier charisma of Henry Lee III, remembered forever by the sobriquet he earned as a rakish and talented officer, Light Horse Harry Lee. To his beloved commander-in-chief, George Washington, young Harry Lee was an indispensable favorite, a junior officer whose audacity, talent for flawless reconnaissance, and somewhat surprising discipline made him the premier partisan commander of the Continental Army. To the men who rode beneath his green and crimson banner, the banner of the independent Lee's Legion, he was a fearless, almost superhuman leader who rode helter-skelter into the thickest fires of battle, executing impossible night raids and sweeping cavalry charges that inspired the Continental ranks. But to his political rivals, his superior officers, and those envious colleagues who watched his meteoric rise, Harry Lee was an arrogant Virginia aristocrat, a man whose unyielding pride, thin-skinned vanity, and refusal to bow to authority made him both tiresome and dangerous. Here lies the central, tragic paradox of the man history remembers as Light Horse Harry. Henry Lee III was a military genius who was, in his own immortal phrasing, wedded to the sword. He was an elite planter scholar, a brilliant student who quoted the classics from memory to the end of his days, and who found his identity, his purpose, his soul in battlefield leadership. On horseback, with sword in hand and a plumed helmet upon his head, Light Horse Harry possessed a staggering clarity of vision. He could read a landscape at a gallop, divine an enemy's hidden weakness through a bank of gun smoke, and execute complex combined arms maneuvers in pitch darkness with a stunning perfection that astounded even his professional military European allies and enemies alike. Yet the very qualities that made him a god of war, his hyper-aggressive self-confidence, his compulsive hunger for personal glory, his aristocratic disdain for conventional boundaries, and his often ungoverned emotional volatility and peace. These were the very flaws that doomed him in the times of peace. Off the battlefield, stripped of the clarifying discipline of military command, Harry Lee was a man completely devoid of baseline commercial common sense. His fragile, razor-thin ego could not endure the slightest hint of criticism or neglect, and his obsessive pursuit of wealth and status in the post-revolutionary world would eventually drag his family through the mud of public scandal, debtor's prison, and ruin. In this chronicle, we will trace the meteoric military career of Light Horse Harry Lee, following his path from his boyhood on the high bluff of Leesylvania, overlooking the Potomac River, to his academic triumphs at Nassau Hall and Princeton, where he mastered the classics alongside the future architects of the American Republic, and won renown as a great scholar before he became known as the American Revolution's dashingest Cavalier. Then we'll ride beside him through the northern mud of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, observing how a 22-year-old captain transformed a small troop of volunteer dragoons from Virginia into Lee's Legion, the feared, immaculately uniformed, and immensely successful partisan unit that Light Horse Harry won renown leading as an independent command. As we do so, we'll cover his masterpieces, from the silent, bayonets-only night assault on the impregnable, or thought to be impregnable, fort at Paulus Hook, to his war in the southern swamps, where his plan, based on his study of Scipio Africanus, liberated the lower South, obliterated the Tories, and drove Lord Cornwallis toward the fatal trap at Yorktown. Finally, we will witness Harry's bitter, petulant exit from the Continental Army, an exit driven by deep exhaustion and perceived slights, as he rode back to the northern neck of Virginia to claim the hand of the divine Matilda and assume the lordship of Stratford Hall. It's the story of a man who defeated an empire, doing so with his sword, only to discover that he could never conquer himself, much to the woe of his family. This is the story of his grand descent. Next time, in our second episode on Light Horse Harry, we'll cover his tragic downfall. So this is the fun part. Henry Lee III entered the world on January 29th, 1756, within the newly completed brick walls of the Leesylvania estate in Prince William County, Virginia, the house and branch of the family we covered in the last episode on the Leesylvania Lees. As the eldest son of Henry Lee II and Lucy Grimes, young Harry inherited a social position that placed him atop the Old Dominion's ruling gentry. As Douglas Southall Freeman puts it in Volume 1 of his R.E. Lee biography, quote, "Fairer prospects than those of Henry Lee in 1781 no young American revolutionary had. Born in 1756 at Leesylvania, Prince William County, Virginia, he was the eldest son of Henry Lee and his wife, Lucy Grimes. From boyhood, he had the high intelligence of his father's distinguished forebears and the physical charm of his beautiful mother. He won a great name at Princeton, where he had been graduated in 1773. But for the coming of the war, he would have gone to England to study law. Instead, before he was 21, he entered the army as a captain in the cavalry regiment commanded by his kinsman, Theodoric Bland. Behind him had been all the influence of a family which included at that time 3 of the outstanding men of the Revolution, his cousins Richard Henry Lee, Arthur Lee, and William Lee." End quote. Much of the dynamism that was remarkable in Harry Lee, quite different from what was typical for the Leesylvania line, came to him through his mother. Lucy Grimes was the celebrated lowland beauty of her generation, a woman of extraordinary physical charm, sharp wit, and radiant intelligence who had famously captured and rejected the youthful, lovesick poetic verses of a young surveyor named George Washington. Through Lucy's bloodline, Harry inherited that vibrant, explosive energy that was to define his life, much in contrast to the traditional demeanor of his Lee ancestors. He got his razor-sharp intellect from both sides of the family, and it was from his father, the horse-loving Henry Lee II, that he got his equestrian talent that was to win him fame and renown. From his earliest boyhood on the high forested bluffs of Freestone Point, Harry was conditioned to master both the page and the stirrup. He was placed on horseback almost as soon as he could walk, learning to navigate the rugged timber tracks of Prince William County with a fearlessness that amazed his grooms. Ryan Cole, noting this in his book, Light Horse Harry Lee, says, quote, "In the years following the birth of the boy, who would be known to posterity as Light Horse Harry Lee, his father's attention turned to practical matters, finding a tutor for the child, and, perhaps even more important, selecting a suitable foal to be trained specifically for his son. Riding was in the blood of aristocratic Virginians. From an early age, the boys across the colony were on horseback, riding to and fro to perform domestic chores. By adolescence, they were expert horsemen." Riding was not the only characteristic talent of Virginians that Harry mastered as a young squire of Leesylvania. He also developed that Virginia habit of command and swaggering self-assurance that was to define his military life for good and ill. He learned it from mixing with the politicians who visited his father's hospitable halls, commanding the workforce, and seeing how the adult gentlemen in his life handled their tenants, politics, and the local yeomen, describing the milieu in which Harry was raised and how it built him into that natural ability to give orders, and indeed to give the right orders. Charles Royster, in his book Light Horse Harry Lee and the Legacy of the American Revolution, notes, quote, "In Virginia, the Lees were accustomed not only to supporting authority, but also to wielding it. Harry's great-great-grandfather, great-grandfather, and granduncle had all served on the Virginia Council. When Harry, the age of 3 or 4, was first taken to the capital at Williamsburg, 6 Lees sat in the House of Burgesses, his father, 2 uncles, and 3 cousins, and the 7th Lee was on the council. 30 years later, when the time seemed ripe for Light Horse Harry to enter the legislature, one of his cousins wrote to another, suggesting that Harry's Uncle Richard retire and make room. Henry Lee grew up learning how to ride horses, give orders, and move among powerful politicians. He always conceived of government as the council of eminent men for the benefit of lesser ones." End quote. When the time arrived for young Harry to secure higher education than could be provided in the forests of Leesylvania, his father decided to depart from the traditional habits of the Tidewater gentry. Rather than sending the 14-year-old youth across the Atlantic to be polished in the aristocratic academies of Eton or London, as was done with his Stratford cousins like Richard Henry and Arthur Lee, as we covered in our episode on those Lee brothers, or enrolling him in the halls of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, as was the case with Thomas Jefferson, for example, Henry Lee II sent his eldest son north. In 1770, Harry arrived in Princeton, New Jersey, to enroll in the College of New Jersey, known as Nassau Hall. When Harry Lee arrived, Princeton was undergoing a profound intellectual and political revolution under the presidency of Dr. John Witherspoon, a formidable, fierce-minded Scottish Presbyterian clergyman who had assumed leadership of the college in 1768. Witherspoon transformed Nassau Hall into an academically rigorous nursery for Whig statesmanship, Republican virtue, and resistance to the crown. As an example of the rigor, the academic day began at 5 o'clock in the morning with mandatory prayers and classical recitations. Young Harry Lee threw himself into this intellectual crucible with the sort of furious energy that was to define his life. He mastered Latin and Greek, translated the complex legal texts of Cicero and the philosophical discourses of Seneca with fluency, noting that the dashing flower of the Leesylvania Lees was not just a remarkable equestrian and beau ideal of the Cavalier, but a remarkable scholar too. Burton Hendrick, in his The Lees of Virginia, notes, quote, "But he had academic qualities as well. He was a serious student. His progress, as President Witherspoon wrote the father, has always been in all respects agreeable. His chief interests being mathematics, natural philosophy, that is science of the Ben Franklin kind, history, English literature, and above all, the classics." Other records disclose that on one occasion Henry Lee received first prize for translating English into Latin, and all his days he was airing his proficiency in the Roman tongue. On another occasion, the third prize for reading English, probably what today would be called declamation, went to the future orator from Virginia. Despite his physical activity and good fellowship, the wilder phases of undergraduate life had little attraction, Harry Lee being especially marked for his interest in religion. End quote. Similarly, Ryan Cole notes that even among genius contemporaries remarkable and famous for their studiousness and intellectual brilliance, Harry Lee held his own and was indeed one of the brightest of the bunch at Princeton. Cole notes, quote, "The competition with the likes of Madison, whose intense studies had compromised his already frail health, and Burr, meaning Aaron Burr, who read 16 hours a day, was stiff. But Lee was every bit their equal, earning the approbation of Witherspoon, who described the boy's progress at Princeton as, quote, in all respects agreeable, end quote, in a letter to his father, end quote. Yet, while his brilliant classmate, James Madison, spent his midnight hours absorbing political philosophy, constitutional design, and covenant theology, Harry Lee's imagination was captivated by a different genre of classical literature. He became obsessed with the military histories of the ancient world and spent endless hours analyzing the campaign memoirs of Julius Caesar, tracing the movements of Xenophon's 10,000 in the Anabasis, and memorizing the battle plans of Hannibal at Cannae and Epaminondas at Leuctra. He studied how ancient commanders moved infantry cohorts across rivers, how light cavalry was deployed to screen a retreat, and how psychological surprise could shatter an army. Among a student body that included future vice presidents, cabinet officers, presidents, and revolutionary leaders such as Madison, Aaron Burr, and the poet Philip Freneau, Harry Lee was already quietly preparing himself for the field of Mars. Dr. Witherspoon recognized the exceptional and intense nature of the young Virginian, writing in his official Academy records that young Harry was, quote, more than strict in his morality, remarkably diligent, and possessed of a fine, penetrating genius, end quote. When Nassau Hall held its commencement exercises in September 1773, the 17-year-old scholar stepped onto the stage to deliver a flamboyant, highly articulate public oration on the liberal arts. A spectator sitting in the audience left behind a vivid description of the young graduate, noting that the slender, remarkably handsome youth was clad in a fine suit of clothes that was stiff with gold lace, a visual detail that revealed Harry's lifelong passion for opulent, high-status display and his family's wealth. Upon graduation from Princeton, Harry's life path looked to be mapped out. Despite his fascination with military affairs, Harry intended to sail for England and enroll in the Middle Temple in London, where he would pursue a prestigious legal education under the patronage and guidance of his maternal uncle, Bilby Porteous, an influential Anglican clergyman who would eventually become the Bishop of London. Armed with a Middle Temple legal degree, Harry would return to Virginia to assume his place at the provincial bar in the House of Burgesses. Generations of Lees had done this. Why should dashing young Harry do otherwise? And as he studied and considered his future career, The future Cavalier of the Revolution was having a grand time being the beau ideal of a Virginia gentleman at the balls, house parties, and fetes that defined the social part of upper-class Tidewater life. As Hendrick notes of Light Horse Harry in this period, quote, "In this early period, Lee's inclination was not for arms but the law. He planned on graduation to go to London and study in good Virginia fashion at Inns of Court. But daily increasing tension between America and England made this impossible. In consequence, Lee passed 3 rather aimless years at the ancestral domain, helping his father in the care of the estate, though probably the greater part of his time was spent attending parties, dancing, playing cards, riding with the hounds, and making love in the Potomac houses, where he immediately became a favorite. He found a congenial associate in his uncle, Squire Richard of Lee Hall. Stratford was one of his stopping places, and he was a special darling of the Carters at Nominee Hall." End quote. Then the world exploded, and Harry Lee got the opportunity to follow in the proud tradition of his Norman ancestors of myth and memory, as we've covered in a past episode, to win renown in the saddle. As news of the Boston Tea Party, the passage of the Coercive Acts, and the fiery speeches of Patrick Henry swept through the Tidewater, the transatlantic shipping lanes were suddenly severed. And in April of 1775, blood flowed on the green at Lexington and the dusty road to Concord. Harry Lee didn't hesitate. A passionate and unyielding Whig who believed with religious conviction in the inherent God-given rights of British American subjects to be free from arbitrary, unrepresentative parliamentary power, Harry, the brilliant scholar, dropped his legal treatises, shelved his scholar's gown, and readied for war. Returning to Prince William County, the 19-year-old scholar picked up a musket, joined the local volunteer militia, and began drilling alongside his neighbors, preparing to defend his native soil by force of arms. The transformation of this Princeton scholar and legal aspirant into the premier cavalry officer of the Revolution occurred with really astonishing speed. In June of 1776, as the Virginia Convention assembled in Williamsburg to draft a new state constitution and instruct its delegates in Philadelphia to propose national independence, something done by Richard Henry Lee, Governor Patrick Henry signed an officer's commission for the 20-year-old Harry Lee. Harry was named captain of the 5th Troop of Virginia Light Dragoons, an elite cavalry unit placed under the general organizational command of his kinsman, Colonel Theodoric Bland. Harry threw himself into the task of military creation with a really fierce intensity, recognizing the cavalry unit was only as effective as its mounts and equipment. Harry deployed his own personal fortune, his family's extensive credit, and his father's horse breeding connections at Leesylvania to equip his troop. While other colonial units marched in mismatched rags and rode farm workhorses, Captain Lee's 5th Troop was mounted on magnificent, blooded Virginia thoroughbreds and brilliantly attired in the glorious aesthetic that was to be its dashing characteristic. He selected his recruits, mostly raw, teenage farm boys from the Northern Neck, with meticulous care, and then subjected them to a grueling, relentless training regime that emphasized horsemanship, saber drills, and obedience under fire. In the late months of 1777, the Virginia Light Dragoons were incorporated into the main Continental Army and ordered north to assist General George Washington, whose forces were battling General William Howe's regulars in the mud and cold of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. It was during the freezing, desperate winter of early 1778, winter of Valley Forge, that Captain Harry Lee and his small troop transformed themselves into the talk of the entire American army. It began with raids. Harry Lee and his troop quickly won renown for their efforts to sever British supply lines, picking off isolated wagon trains and troops in a merciless war in the snowy, miserable northern forests. While not enough to starve the British out, these brilliantly executed pinprick raids were enough to cause them serious discomfort. Enough discomfort, in fact, that they tried using their own cavalry to assassinate this young Cavalier. That came in January of 1778. While stationed at an exposed outpost near Spread Eagle Tavern in Pennsylvania, Captain Lee and a tiny detachment of just 10 dragoons were betrayed by a local loyalist. And so a massive force of nearly 200 British light cavalrymen seeking to capture and kill the famous young Virginian were sent at him like a missile. They quietly surrounded the stone tavern under a cover of morning fog. But woken by the alarm, Harry didn't panic, recognizing that his tiny troop would be cut to pieces if they attempted to mount their horses in the open yard and flee, he ordered his 10 men to barricade the tavern doors, drag heavy oak tables against the windows, and take up positions with their carbines. What followed was an astounding display of cold-blooded bravery and martial excellence. As 200 British horsemen surged towards the stone house, firing their pistols and demanding he surrender, Harry Lee paced calmly from window to window, directing his 10 men to fire in precise, alternating volleys. Each time a British squad attempted to breach a door or smash a window, they were met with blistering, point-blank fire that shattered their ranks. And indeed, it was so intense that it forced many of them to believe that far more than 10 men were hunkered down within the stone farmhouse. Harry did his part in this. He ran between the rooms, shouting out fake orders to non-existent reinforcements in the attic to convince the enemy that the tavern was heavily garrisoned. For over 20 minutes, the 10 Americans held the stone fort, killing and wounding dozens of the attackers and dropping the British horses in the yard. Baffled by this tenacious defense and believing that Washington's main army was riding to the rescue, the British cavalry commander ordered a humiliating full-scale retreat. 10 men had just bested 20 times their number. News of the stand at Spread Eagle Tavern swept through the depressed encampment at Valley Forge like a wildfire. America needed a victory, a demonstration of its will to win and its ability to win. Here that victory was. The misery at Valley Forge was still intense, but this was the sort of win that could inspire the ranks and show them that even small numbers of brave Americans could make a difference and best the British. General Washington, deeply moved by the incredible composure and the tactical brilliance of his young fellow Virginia gentlemen, published a formal order of the day praising Harry Lee's bravery and flawless conduct. Washington personally invited the 22-year-old captain to dinner at headquarters, where he presented Harry with a pair of fine silver-mounted pistols and offered him an extraordinary professional honor, a coveted permanent post as Washington's personal aide-de-camp with the rank of lieutenant colonel. To pretty much any other young officer in the Continental Service, an appointment as Washington's personal aide was the ultimate prize. It was safe, it was a prestigious position, and it was at the very center of military power. This guaranteed rapid promotion and political favor. Such is why Alexander Hamilton performed the duty rather than serving in the ranks, as he wanted out in the battle line. But Harry Lee was not built for headquarters staff work, and he knew it. He was a man who hungered for personal battlefield glory with a passion that bordered on madness. He couldn't restrain himself for years as Alexander Hamilton could. And Harry Lee knew he would falter with the pen where he could succeed with the sword. And so, in a famous, astonishingly candid letter that he sent to Washington, the young captain respectfully declined the commander-in-chief's offer. Harry wrote, quote, "I am wedded to my sword. My secondary object in the present war is military reputation, a stimulus to glory, second to none. I cannot bear the thought of being secluded from the immediate field of action where alone that glory can be purchased." End quote. I think Charles Royster describes Harry's decision and why he made it best, showing the sort of spirit, impulse, and thought that defined Harry's military career. Royster writes, and I will quote here at some length, but I think it necessary to show what Harry was about at this stage of his life. Quote, "At Valley Forge, the 22-year-old Captain Lee made a decision whose potential significance for his future he may have hardly realized. George Washington sent Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton to invite Lee to join the Commander-in-Chief's staff as an aide-de-camp. In reply, Lee wrote to Washington that he was ready to serve wherever he was ordered, but he preferred to command dragoons. I am wedded to my sword." Lee knew many of the advantages of the post he was declining. In addition to keeping him near Washington, it would provide a field for military instruction and would lead me into an intimate acquaintance with the politics of the states. Indeed, after the war, a disproportionately large number of Washington's former aides, most conspicuously Hamilton himself, rose to prominence and power as businessmen, attorneys, and Federalist Party office holders. In saying no to Washington, Lee disclosed the specialized meaning war held for him, the more focused enthusiasm that turned him away from concerns of logistical planning, large-scale strategy, or civil affairs, and toward the calculations of the partisan. To Washington, Lee gave as his reasons a most affectionate friendship for my soldiers, a fraternal love for the two officers who have served with me, a zeal for the honor of the cavalry, and an opinion that I should render more real service to your Excellency's arms. Washington was not offended. A few days later, he recommended that Congress create the independent partisan corps that would enhance Lee's ability to fight the kind of war he loved best. Many young officers, eager as Lee was to build a military reputation, would have agreed that they could serve the cause better in a field command than on the staff. Lee, however, was wedded to a special branch of warfare, and when he called such service more real, he may have meant, in part, the heightened clarity and order that he imposed on violence. Although the Legion was effective in battle, Lee's claim to have served the cause rested less on killing the enemy than outthinking him. Raids on a dozen Paulus hooks might have done less harm to the British than one major battlefield defeat. Thus, he did not seek the positions in the army from which he might do the enemy the most damage as a line commander, or himself the most good as an aide to Washington. He wanted to fight in the way that gave combat the fullest union of excitement and rationality. Lee's wartime career suggests that, above all, this purposefulness in defying the enemy with stratagem and discipline gave him his love for arms. End quote. So, far from being offended or perturbed by this extraordinary refusal of the young captain, Washington was captivated by Harry's audacious and unyielding warrior spirit. Instead of punishing him for his refusal or pressing him to accept an unwanted role, ordering him to it, Washington engineered an unprecedented compromise which elevated this Virginia Cavalier to the heights of glory. He convinced Congress to promote Harry to the rank of major and grant him an independent, highly specialized command. A mixed force of elite light cavalry and light infantry, designated officially as the Partisan Corps, but known to history as Lee's Legion. Such was the envy of every young cavalry commander on the hunt for renown, and the perfect role for Harry Lee. Describing this in his The Lees of Virginia, Nagel notes, quote, "In April 1778, with Washington's prodding, and while Harry's cousins Richard Henry and Frank Lee were still highly influential, Congress put an independent partisan corps under Major Harry Lee's command, including both cavalry and infantry. The unit became known as Lee's Legion, and its commander is Light Horse Harry. The Legion's skill and swift movement and lightning-like attack demonstrated Harry's undoubted talent for leadership and assault. Success, however, appeared to depend on whether Harry, and only Harry, was in charge." End quote. Similarly, James Young, in his work Marsh Robert, a tale of Harry Lee's son, Robert E. Lee, notes how this promotion of Light Horse Harry, a guest in Washington's home since childhood and an exceptionally talented young man, fit into General Washington's general inclination to promote young men of talent. He writes, quote, "This soldier stands high among the Lees. He had special talent for the kind of warfare the Revolution proved to be. The Continental Army needed men of enterprise, opposed to forces often superior in numbers and always better trained and equipped. Theirs was a war of sudden descents, surprises, swift actions, and hasty retreats. Washington liked young men and gave them responsible posts under the censure of older heads. On his recommendation, Congress named Lee to a partisan command, one of the odd military organizations of the Revolution. With 3 mounted companies and 3 afoot, Lee moved as he liked, attacked and ran when he could, or needs must. A post of honor for a youngster in his green 20s." End quote. Young adds, further noting why Washington might have found Harry's spirit and pluck attractive and worthy of not just commendation, but promotion, quote, "Light Horse Harry was the beau ideal of the American soldier, sitting handsomely upon his white horse, his hair flowing, his eye commanding. A cavalier of the blue strain, he delighted to ride helter-skelter straight into the British army, swinging a saber. Leader and legion had a capacity for endurance, for daring attempts that seemed uniformly to succeed, which few commands of the army could match. Exactly the sort of man who would appeal to the great George." End quote. Harry ruled Lee's Legion with absolute authority. He designed a striking, iconic uniform for his men that set them apart from other units during the war. Short, fitted jackets of rich green cloth with brilliant crimson facings and linings, immaculate white leather riding breeches, high boots, and brass-fitted leather helmets topped with flowing horsehair plumes. He always had an eye for aesthetic brilliance, this flower of the Leesylvania Lees. Harry was obsessed with military presentation, sternly instructing his officers that an army's operational reputation depended heavily upon the cleanliness, parade, and immaculateness of its men. He enforced a level of physical discipline, horse care, and weapons maintenance that was unmatched in the service. And so Lee's Legion became an elite, hypermobile strike force, a lethal instrument of war, completely devoted to its young, green-coated commander. Describing these attributes of Lee's Legion and how it both personified and reflected young Harry, Hendrick notes, quote, Lee's very appearance suggested the heroic mood. The uniform in which he delighted was a tall leather helmet with horsehair plumes streaming in the wind, green jacket, white lambskin breeches, shining boots reaching to the knees. Seated on his favorite Virginia mount, rushing with saber drawn at the head of his 300 troopers against the foe, that was Harry Lee's conception of the military art. As to the brilliant appearance of these troops, Washington is himself a witness. The perfection in which he has kept his corps, as well as the handsome exploits he has performed, are among the reasons advanced to Congress by the Commander-in-Chief for Lee's promotion. To Washington's army, he performed a service not unlike that rendered by Jeb Stuart to the Army of Northern Virginia in 61 to 64. There was much hand-to-hand fighting. There were scouting expeditions for information, raids in search of munitions and food, sudden attacks led by the redoubtable Harry, accompanied by the screaming of his followers, harbinger, perhaps, of the coming rebel yell. And Harry Lee was a good deal of the swashbuckler, and he had other qualities of the character. A grandiloquent manner of speech, boastfulness about his deeds, even now and then a touch of cruelty. End quote. By the summer of 1779, Major Harry Lee was actively searching for a spectacular operational opportunity that would establish his name alongside the legendary heroes of antiquity. Eager to emulate General Mad Anthony Wayne's brilliant surprise bayonet assault on the British garrison at Stony Point, Harry turned his eye towards the British fortifications at Paulus Hook. Paulus Hook was a low, sandy, marshy peninsula projecting into the Hudson River directly opposite New York City, present-day Jersey City. It was an extraordinarily formidable position, one thought to be impregnable, in fact. It was surrounded by deep salt water, a tidal moat, triple line of abatis, wood palisades, and heavy earthwork redoubts, garrisoned by several hundred veteran British and Hessian regulars. And Harry knew that to cross that saltwater marsh and take it would be of immense credit to his name and the name of his unit, so it became the apple of his eye. Harry spent weeks gathering intelligence, deploying his spies, mapping the tidal flows, and personally scouting the approaches through the Jersey swamps. On the dark, moonless night of August 18th, 1779, Lee launched his masterpiece assault. Leading a strike force of 400 picked men from his legion and the Virginia Lee line, Harry executed a grueling 12-mile march through the deep, waterlogged swamps and treacherous mountain tracks, all at night. The march was a nightmare of friction. Guide officers lost their way in the pitch darkness. Ammunition was soaked by marsh water, and a major contingent of his infantry became separated in the woods. Undeterred by these disasters, Harry reached the edge of the Paulus Hook tidal ditch at 3 o'clock in the morning, just as the tide was beginning to rise. Recognizing that his men's gunpowder was ruined by water, Harry made the sort of situation-salvaging snap judgment that defined his military career. He ordered his troops to fix bayonets, shoulder their useless muskets, and follow him into the deep, black water. Silently wading through the neck-deep tidal ditch, the Americans achieved absolute surprise. Before the British sentries could sound the alarm or fire a single cannon, Lee's greencoats surged over the earthen parapets, clearing the redoubts at the point of the bayonet. In a furious 20-minute melee conducted completely in the dark, Lee's men captured the main fort, securing nearly 160 British, Hessian, and Loyalist prisoners, including a number of senior officers. And then, recognizing that British warships in New York Harbor were already sounding alarm guns and preparing to cross the river, Harry displayed a remarkable amount of discipline and restraint, uncharacteristic of him throughout his life. He refused to waste precious minutes attempting to burn the heavy barracks or blow up the iron cannons, and so, gathering his prisoners, Lee executed a brilliant and rapid retreat through the New Jersey countryside, successfully evading the British relief columns that could have crushed him, and he returned to the main army without losing a single man in the assault. Overall, American casualties in this entire saga totaled just 2 dead and 3 wounded. The miracle of his success at Paulus Hook led to immense celebrations throughout the country, but the aftermath also brought Harry Lee face to face with the dark and toxic underbelly of military jealousy. Infuriated by the 23-year-old major's rapid promotion, his direct access to Washington, and his insufferable aristocratic arrogance, a faction of senior officers led by Colonel Nathaniel Gist brought formal court-martial charges against Lee, They accused him of insubordination, misconduct, abandoning his men during the retreat, and giving improper orders to senior officers. It was a vicious and politically motivated attempt to destroy this young hero's reputation. Wounded and burning with the sort of toxic and thin-skinned fury that unfortunately defined much of his career in War and Peace, Harry roared back at his accusers. In fact, he decided to handle the matter personally. He refused to hire legal counsel and conducted his own defense before the military tribunal. And he succeeded in this. He was going to be a lawyer after all. He delivered a brilliant, razor-sharp legal performance and shredded the prosecution's attempts at evidence while exposing the petty jealousy of his accusers. The court-martial acquitted Major Lee of every single charge with the highest and most honorable terms. But the experience left Harry somewhat embittered and sensitive to comments on his conduct and successes. This was to prove a problem for him, as Nagel notes, writing, quote, "Unable to accept criticism, Harry did not recognize that he was often opposed by fellow officers mainly because he was arrogant, vain, imperious, ambitious to a fault, and painfully sensitive. He quarreled easily, a trait which in time forced another appearance before a court-martial. Certainly at least a few of Harry's loudest foes spoke from envy, while others assailed him simply because he was a member of the controversial Lee family. But Harry insisted that every one of his critics came from these camps. This blindness kept the young officer in a near-perpetual fury, and he refused to be calmed, even by soothing from so sage a friend as his superior, General Greene. To his complete vindication, a contrite Continental Congress voted to award Harry a special official gold medal of honor struck in his likeness, making Henry Lee III the only officer below the rank of general to receive such an honor during the entire Revolutionary War. He had won his laurels, he had won his spurs, but the bitter experience of being court-martialed by his own countrymen, his fellow officers, men he thought to be gentlemen, left a permanent scar upon Harry Lee's psyche, deepening his paranoid belief that inferior men were constantly conspiring to rob him of his rightful glory. In late 1780, promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, Harry and Lee's legion were ordered south to reinforce General Nathaniel Greene in the Carolinas. The Southern campaign was a different species of conflict from the formal, conventional warfare of the North. In the pine barrens, swamps, and red clay hills of the lower South, the war had devolved into a savage, uncompromising civil war between loyalist and patriot neighbors. A conflict characterized by summary executions, house burnings, and no quarter. It was a war to the knife, and the perfect environment for an independent legion of dragoons and light infantry. Harry was to excel in it, notching victory after victory in raids upon the British and their Tory allies. It was within this brutal, lawless environment that the darkest and terrifying aspect of Harry Lee's volatile temperament was laid bare. Early in 1781, during a screening operation near the Haw River, Harry sent his favorite personal bugler, an unarmed 15-year-old boy named Gillies, to retrieve a spare horse from a local farm. While riding alone, young Gillies was suddenly ambushed and surrounded by a patrol of ruthless loyalist dragoons belonging to the infamous Colonel Bannister Tarleton's command. Despite the boy's helpless condition and his cries for quarter, the loyalist cavalrymen slashed the teenage bugler to pieces with their sabers, leaving his body in the road. When Harry Lee rode up and discovered the bloody, mangled corpse of his young bugler, he went berserk, and his usual composure on the field of battle left him. Tears of unbridled rage streamed down his dust-covered face, and Lee spurred his horse forward, leading his legion in a frantic pursuit with one thing on his mind: merciless vengeance. Cornering the loyalist cavalry patrol in a narrow lane, Lee's greencoats drew their heavy broadswords and charged. What followed was a furious melee and total obliteration of the British unit. Refusing to take prisoners or listen to pleas for mercy, Lee's men hacked down 18 of the loyalist horsemen on the spot, leaving them in the red dirt. Harry personally ordered the British officer in command to prepare for hanging from a roadside oak tree, and was only prevented from executing the man when a sudden movement of Cornwallis's main army forced the legion to clear the area. The scholar of Nassau Hall had proven that when his fierce, ancestral Norman blood was inflamed, he could match the most ruthless killers of the frontier in cold, terrifying violence. He had shown this before, ordering the beheading of a deserter in the northern campaigns, something that shocked Washington, and Washington told him to not do that again. But this was on a grander scale, and in the heat of the moment, rather than in a calculated display of severity meant to stop desertion. The Cavalier showed nothing could stop him when his blood was up. In any case, this sort of small unit fighting was the perfect venue for Harry Lee as he sought to win his spurs again and again, and his name echoed through the South as he won engagement after engagement alongside his dragoons and light infantry, earning him that sobriquet from which he's famous, Light Horse Harry Lee. Yet, Harry Lee's greatest historical contribution to the War of Independence was not actually any one of these little cavalry charges, nor was it his penchant for being merciless in his retribution. Rather, it was the development of a brilliant and far-reaching strategy for winning the South, showing that the dashing cavalryman had brains and understood his military strategy as well as his tactics. His display of this came in the early spring of 1781, following the British forces' Pyrrhic victory at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. You see, General Nathaniel Greene faced a strategic dilemma. Lord Cornwallis's battered British army had withdrawn to the coast at Wilmington, North Carolina, to resupply. Most American officers wanted Greene to follow Cornwallis, keeping his army between the British and Virginia. Harry Lee possessed a different and radical vision, a strategy he explicitly modeled on Scipio Africanus's ancient decision to bypass Hannibal in Italy and strike directly at Carthage. That classical study did help him, after all. So he rode to Greene's headquarters tent and presented a bold, counterintuitive proposal. It was this. Rather than pursuing Cornwallis into North Carolina, Greene's army should turn its back on the British commander and march into South Carolina. Harry argued that by combining Greene's regulars with the local partisan militia bands led by Francis Marion, the famous Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, the Americans could systematically reduce the isolated chain of British backcountry forts. Fort Watson, Fort Moat, Fort Granby, Fort Cornwallis in 96, that held the interior of South Carolina and Georgia in subjection. Doing so would wipe away British influence in the area, allow Patriot forces to obliterate the Tories, and present the opportunity for a major victory in the South by cutting Cornwallis off from bases of supply, support, and reinforcement on which he relied. It was an Operation Gamble, in fact, a gamble of the highest order, and Greene embraced it completely. Unleashed on the British and Tories, Lee's Scipio Africanus strategy worked with flawless efficiency. Bypassed and confused by Greene's southward pivot, Cornwallis made the fatal decision to abandon the Carolinas and march to the north into Virginia, setting the stage for his ultimate isolation and defeat at Yorktown. Meanwhile, Lee's legion served as the hypermobile spearhead of the Southern campaign. Operating in tactical coordination with Francis Marion's swamp partisans, Harry Lee conducted a lightning campaign across the lower South, using brilliant siege tactics, psychological ruses, and coordinated cavalry infantry attacks of the sort that defined his ability to handle Lee's legion with its mixed cavalry and infantry well. Lee's legion captured Fort Watson, forced the surrender of Fort Moat by firing incendiary arrows directly into its shingle roof, reduced Fort Granby, and forced the capitulation of Fort Cornwallis at Augusta. In less than 6 months, Harry Lee and Nathaniel Greene had dismantled the British network in the Deep South, liberating South Carolina and Georgia, and driving the remaining British garrisons into the narrow coastal enclaves of Charleston, Savannah, from which they could do little to support the Tories on whom Cornwallis had based his southern strategy. Remember, he was in the South because he thought the Tories would rise up to support him and help effect a British political victory in the South. That was impossible once he had been pushed north and his forts and troops had been wiped away and pushed back to the coast. The Tories were obliterated. Harry's classics-informed brilliance had helped America win the war, and his tactical genius helped the strategy he developed succeed. But his pride, his haughtiness, his overbearing attitude caused him similar problems in the Carolinas as it had in the northern campaigns. As Charles Royster writes, describing Harry's good and bad qualities as a leader of men being on full display in the southern campaign, quote, "Many officers who, given a legion of their own, could not have rivaled Lee's mastery of discipline and tactical command, probably preferred to impute his greater fame to the commander's favoritism rather than to Lee's superior ability. Lee, however, compounded their envy by his arrogance. He was not one of the belligerent officers who tried to prove their distinction by frequent duels and fits of temper. Rather, he took his position and his glory as his due. He treated less meritorious patriots with the condescension they deserved. Such a demeanor especially irked the Carolina militiamen. Some of them later recalled their resentment at having to support well-fed, well-dressed, well-mounted mercenaries who looked down upon them as inferiors. They saw Lee acting like the higher orders of Virginia gentlemen. This behavior included a habitual indifference to please those considered by Colonel Lee his inferiors. He treated militia privates and officers as he would have treated his plantation overseers. It was a common remark among the Carolinians that Lee would rather a dozen militiamen should be killed than one of his government horses. End quote. The haughtiness of the Virginia patrician could be a bit much, even if backed up by noble deeds and great victories. Harry struggled to learn, much less understand this. By the autumn of 1781, as the combined French and American forces under George Washington, the Count de Rochambeau, completely surrounded Lord Cornwallis's army on the slick peninsula of Yorktown, Virginia, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Lee was dispatched north by Greene to serve as a high-level military liaison. On October 19, 1781, Harry stood in his immaculate green and crimson uniform upon the formal parade grounds of Yorktown, watching as 8,000 British and Hessian regulars marched out between the Allied lines to ground their arms, their drums sadly beating the old British march, the world turned upside down. It was the absolute, triumphant culmination of the war, the moment of ultimate victory that Harry had dreamt of since his days as a scholar. Yet, as he watched the surrender ceremony, Harry's heart wasn't really filled with joy. It was filled with bitterness. He felt underappreciated, neglected, and ignored. While senior officers who had done little actual fighting were showered with public accolades, military promotions, and congressional praise, Harry remained a mere lieutenant colonel. He convinced himself that a cabal of jealous Continental officers and political detractors had organized to rob him of his rightful credit for the Southern campaign, minimizing his brilliant strategy and treating him as a minor partisan raider rather than a master strategist. Nagel, describing Lee at this moment of what should have been triumph, writes, quote, "And now that Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown and the war was concluding, Harry was bored by a soldier's life." End quote. Physical and psychological exhaustion rapidly claimed what was left of his health. 6 years of continuous, high-stakes military command, of night marches, wounds, marsh fevers, court-martials, emotional tension, now boredom, had completely burned out 25-year-old officer who was also jealous and always in a state of pique with his fellow officers. And so Harry Lee fell into a deep and dark depression, characterized by mood swings, paranoid outbursts, and a bitter, petulant hatred for most of those around him. In January of 1782, unable to endure the toxic atmosphere of the army any longer, Harry Lee sent a dramatic and self-pitying letter of resignation to General Nathaniel Greene. He declared that his health was utterly ruined and his military honor systematically destroyed by the malice and envy of his fellow officers. General Greene, who genuinely loved young Harry and recognized his military genius and tactical brilliance and bravery, responded to what was a very harsh and unfair letter with magnanimity and attempted to soothe his favorite officer's shattered ego. Greene wrote back to him in a warm, prophetic letter in which he attempted to dissuade Harry from resigning. In it, he offered a profound warning that cut to the chase and cut to the core of Lee's identity. He wrote, quote, "You have served your country with distinguished glory, but you suffer your feelings to get the better of your judgment. You are going home and you will get married, but you cannot cease to be a soldier. The quiet life of a private citizen will never satisfy a mind forged in the fire of Mars." End quote. General Greene's prophetic warning unfortunately fell on deaf ears. Harry's thin-skinned, wounded pride demanded a dramatic exit. Stripping off his green uniform, packing away his silver-mounted pistols, the 26-year-old war hero turned his back upon the Continental Army, mounted his horse, and rode north toward the familiar, rolling hills of the northern neck of Virginia. This was to be the moment his life had reached its apogee and the descent began. Harry Lee was not a man for peace, and leaving his men before the war was over was not to be to his credit. But he was gone, headed home in a fit of life-destroying pique. As Royster writes, quote, Lee left the Continental Army before the war ended. He said that ill health obliged him to go home, but Nathaniel Greene came closer to the truth when he wrote, "Your complaints originated more in the distresses of the mind than in the ruins of your constitution." Before sending the letter, Greene softened it by alluding only to distress. However, his original words remained accurate. Late in 1781 and early in 1782, discontent and self-pity overcame Lee in a way that even he found hard to explain. He referred to his own behavior as "my stupid conduct." His friends told him that he was making a mistake. In December 1782, the men of the Legion marched in the place of honor at the head of Greene's army when it entered Charleston. But for more than 10 months, Lee had not been with them. He ended his wartime soldiering not in triumph, but in resentful isolation. End quote. At the time, however, the Cavalier of the Revolution's prospects looked brighter than that. His destination was Stratford Hall, that not quite majestic, but very impressive baronial brick seat of the primary line of the Lee family. Stratford was undergoing a major domestic transition. Its former master, Philip Ludwell Lee, Harry's overbearing, loyalist-leaning, but talented uncle, had died several years earlier, leaving the great 4,100-acre estate and its 18-room Georgian manor house to his eldest daughter, Matilda Lee. The estate was being managed and even defended in the war, actually, by Matilda's uncle, Richard Henry Lee, who we covered in a past episode. Though far from a commercial genius, Richard Henry had kept the estate as intact and profitable as could be hoped in the midst of war, and so Matilda was a catch in more ways than one. She was a young woman of extraordinary beauty, intelligence, and fortune, a reigning belle of Virginia society who was known universally throughout the Tidewater gentry as the Divine Matilda. And, of course, she was rich. So here's another one of those matrimonial alliances for which the Lees were famous, the fusion of the dashing Cavalier with the rich belle of the ball. Harry had visited Stratford as a youth, but when he rode up the long driveway in the spring of 1782, he arrived not as just a cousin of some cadet branch of the family off in the wilds, but as light horse Harry Lee, the most famous, romantic, and decorated cavalry hero of the American Revolution. As could be expected in such circumstances, the courtship was swift and triumphant. The Divine Matilda was completely captivated by this Cavalier, the handsome, green-coated war hero whose military exploits were celebrated in every newspaper on the continent. And Harry was equally enchanted by the prospect of securing both a beautiful wife and the greatest landed estate in the area. In April of 1782, the wedding was celebrated within the high-ceilinged central hall of Stratford. By virtue of his marriage to a second cousin, the 26-year-old younger sons from Leesylvania, his eldest son, misread that, stepped into the shoes of his ancestors, becoming the Lord of Stratford Hall and reuniting the Leesylvania Lees with the Stratford Hall Lees. He traded his plumed cavalry helmet for the velvet coats of a country squire, exchanging the bloody mud of the southern swamps for the quiet, book-lined parlors and manicured lawns of the northern neck. He wrote to his old military comrades that he had finally discovered his hidden obscurity, a peaceful domestic sanctuary where he intended to spend his remaining days farming his fields, reading his classical histories, and enjoying the quiet devotion of his beautiful bride. But as the curtain falls upon this glorious, triumphant first chapter of Light Horse Harry's life, the dark shadow of the future looms large. The brilliant young warrior had successfully left the field of battle, but Nathaniel Greene's warning remained true. Harry Lee could never truly cease to be a soldier, nor could he become a farmer. Those hyper-aggressive instincts, the reckless daring, and the hunger for illimitable glory that had made him a genius in the war were about to be turned loose upon the complex, treacherous world of peacetime capitalism. Stripped of the violent, clarifying discipline of military command, military life, the new Lord of Stratford was about to embark upon a catastrophic spree of land speculation, financial schemes, fraud, reckless political gambles, a downward spiral that would destroy his fortune, alienate his greatest friends, see him locked inside the cold stone walls of 2 debtors' prisons, and leave his family in the ruin of genteel poverty as he fled to the West Indies. The gallant Blade had conquered the British Empire, but he could never conquer himself. He lacked the restraint, the poise, the self-denial that defined the more successful members of the Virginia gentry. And so, in the peaceful years that lay ahead, he would completely destroy himself. and almost destroyed the name of Lee forever. I'll end with what Royster said, describing the transition in Harry Lee's life from glory-bedecked hero to a man forever on the decline, destroyed by those sins he could never quite master. Quote, "Few Americans saw as much of the Revolutionary War as Light Horse Harry Lee did. Few Americans suffered reverses so complete in the years that followed, and few Americans grew so isolated from their country." End quote. Such is what we'll cover next time. Thank you for listening. Thank you very, very much for listening, actually. Since you made it to the end, please leave a like on this video. Please share it around with people who might be interested. That is how we grow and keep this channel growing. So it's a big help when you do so. And if you leave a comment letting me know what you thought, that really does help as well. One thing I would like to know, actually, is whether you like the long quotes that I include in the episodes or not. I've gone back and forth with doing that because on one hand, I think it's helpful to cite my sources and include those in the episodes themselves to show that I'm not just making stuff up. I'm not just some wordy fellow on the internet, but that this is well cited, well researched, and is true and accurate. And so you're actually learning something. And I think the quotes, particularly the longer quotes, help show that, because then you can check it out and check out those books. That's also why I include the links in the footnotes and the descriptions of the video. But on the other hand, sometimes they break up the narrative. I know they're sometimes long, though I think that has to be done because of what they are. So if you let me know in a comment what you think about those, that's quite helpful. And then finally, last thing I'll add, in each show description, assuming you're not listening on Substack already, there's a link to the Substack where these episodes are available ad-free, so you don't have to continually be interrupted by McDonald's ads or whatever. It's $8 a month to subscribe. You get ad-free episodes like this in addition to other things like paywalled articles and recordings of those articles. If you can subscribe, if you can afford $8 a month or $80 a year, it's of huge help to me. It helps keep this going. It's more stable revenue than relying on ads. So if you're able to, please check that out. Please subscribe. I do quite appreciate it. But thank you for listening. Thank you for making it to the end of this episode. Please join me next time for part 2 on the life of Light Horse Harry Lee, where we cover his descent. Bye.